The air on the pitch was thick with the smell of turned earth, cut grass, and the sharp tang of impending rain. For the St. Jude's High First 15 rugby team, the chill in the air had nothing to do with the weather. Liam, their captain, their rock, and their primary fly half, was gone. A devastating tackle in the previous week's match had resulted in a shattered collarbone and a torn ACL. His season was over, and with it, the cohesive glue that held the team together. Kale stood on the touchline, his cleats sinking into the soft mud. At 18, he possessed a frame built for endurance and impact, broad-shouldered, thick-thighed, and entirely unyielding. He was a flanker, a player whose entire existence on the pitch relied on discipline, pain tolerance, and tactical aggression. He was also fiercely straight, focused entirely on his grades, his family, and getting a university sports scholarship. He didn't have time for drama. Unfortunately, drama was currently doing warm-up stretches 10 feet away. Jackson was a winger. He was built differently than Kale, leaner, faster, tightly coiled like a spring, and undeniably arrogant. He was openly gay, unapologetically loud, and possessed a natural, fluid talent for the game that made Kale's blood boil. While Kale trained for hours to perfect a passing drill, Jackson would show up 10 minutes late, chew a piece of gum, and execute a perfect offload while barely looking at the ball. They hated each other. It was a well-documented, loudly vocalized disdain. Kale thought Jackson was a reckless showboat who didn't respect the structure of the game. Jackson thought Kale was a rigid, boring, meat-headed stickler who played with a stick lodged up his spine. Coach Miller blew his whistle, the sharp trill cutting through the damp air. "Bring it in." 30 boys jogged toward the center of the pitch, the heavy thud of cleats echoing in the quiet morning. Kale took his usual spot near the front. Jackson sauntered in a moment later, casually leaning against one of the massive props, his dark eyes scanning the coach with lazy indifference. "I won't sugarcoat it," Coach Miller barked, his hands on his hips. "Losing Liam is a massive blow. But the season doesn't stop because we're down a man. We need a new captain, someone who understands discipline, someone who isn't going to try and be a hero, but will hold the line." Kale kept his eyes forward, his jaw tight. He knew he was in the running, but he also knew Jackson was the highest scorer on the team. "Kale," Coach Miller said, his voice ringing with finality, "you're stepping up. You're our new captain." A collective murmur rippled through the squad. Kale exhaled a slow, controlled breath. "Thank you, Coach. I won't let you down." He didn't look at Jackson, but he could feel the sudden, searing heat of the winger's glare burning into the side of his skull. Jackson stepped forward, his lazy demeanor vanishing, replaced by a coiled, venomous anger. "Are you serious?" Jackson demanded, his voice dangerously low. "He doesn't have the vision for it. He plays like a damn robot, Coach. You put him in charge, and our offense is going to stall out." "My decision is final, Jackson," Miller snapped. "Kale has the discipline this team needs to rebuild its foundation. If you have a problem with it, you can turn in your jersey." Jackson's jaw locked. He looked from the coach to Kale. The hatred in Jackson's eyes was so thick it was almost tangible. He didn't say another word. He just turned and spat into the mud, stepping back into the ranks. The throne was Kale's, but the war had just begun. The first 3 weeks of Kale's captaincy were a living nightmare. Jackson didn't quit the team, but he made it his personal mission to make Kale's life hell on the pitch. He would deliberately ignore Kale's play calls, executing rogue runs that, while sometimes successful, completely shattered the team's formation. During tackling drills, Jackson always hit Kale just a fraction of a second too late, driving his shoulder into Kale's ribs with unnecessary malice. "You need to pass the damn ball when I call the switch, Jackson," Kale roared one afternoon, wiping a mixture of sweat and mud from his forehead. "Maybe if you called a play that wasn't straight out of a 1990s playbook, I would." Jackson shot back, panting, his chest heaving under his tight practice jersey. "Try keeping up, Captain." It was during this period of intense hostility that Sarah made her presence known. Sarah was a girl from Kale's AP Calculus class. She was sweet, soft-spoken, and painfully obvious about her crush on him. She started showing up to their afternoon practices, sitting on the cold metal bleachers wrapped in a scarf, doing her homework while she watched. Whenever there was a water break, she would trot down to the fence, offering Kale a bright blue sports drink and a glowing smile. "You're doing really great, Kale," she would say, tucking a piece of hair behind her ear. "The team looks so good under your leadership." "Thanks, Sarah," Kale would reply, offering a tight, polite smile. He liked Sarah well enough, but his mind was too consumed by the stress of the team and his boiling hatred for his winger to entertain the idea of a high school romance. Jackson, however, watched these interactions like a hawk. Initially, Jackson thought it was pathetic. He would watch Kale try to act polite while chugging the sports drink, rolling his eyes at the sheer, heteronormative boredom of it all. But as the days passed, something ugly and dark began to twist in Jackson's gut whenever Sarah approached the fence. He didn't understand it. He hated Kale. Kale was obnoxious, rigid, and annoying. But seeing Sarah look at Kale with such blatant adoration made Jackson's skin crawl. He wanted to knock the bright blue bottle out of Kale's hand. He wanted to grab Kale by the collar and drag him back onto the pitch where he belonged. Where he belonged to the team. Where he belonged to the game. The breaking point arrived during a brutal, full-contact scrimmage in the pouring rain. The pitch was a swamp. The boys were covered head to toe in freezing, slick mud. Kale called a defensive lineout, shouting over the roar of the downpour. The ball was thrown in and chaos erupted. Jackson, entirely ignoring his position on the wing, shot into the breakdown. Kale had just secured the ball and was pivoting to pass when Jackson hit him. It wasn't an illegal tackle, but it was ferocious. Jackson's shoulder slammed into Kale's midsection. The breath left Kale's lungs in a harsh rush as his feet were swept out from under him. They crashed to the ground together, a tangle of heavy, muscular limbs sliding through the thick mud. Kale hit his back hard, the cold sludge splashing over his face. He was immediately furious, preparing to shove Jackson off him and scream at him for ruining the drill. But as the mud settled, Kale froze. Jackson was straddling his hips, his forearms planted in the mud on either side of Kale's head, trapping him. Jackson was panting heavily, drops of rain and sweat sliding down his jaw, cutting clean tracks through the dirt on his face. For a split second, the anger in Jackson's eyes vanished. As Jackson looked down at Kale, at his wide, startled eyes, his flushed skin, the heavy rise and fall of his chest beneath his soaked jersey, the animosity fractured. It shattered into a million pieces, replaced by a sudden, terrifying realization that hit Jackson harder than any tackle ever had. He didn't hate Kale. The obsession, the constant need to provoke him, the burning anger when Sarah was around, it wasn't disdain. It was an overwhelming, violent attraction. Kale felt the shift. He couldn't articulate it, but he felt the tension in Jackson's body change. The aggressive pressure of Jackson's thighs pinning his own suddenly felt entirely different. Jackson's dark eyes dropped, just for a fraction of a second, to Kale's lips. "Get off me," Kale grunted, his voice sounding strangely hollow, betraying a sudden, inexplicable panic. Jackson blinked, the mask slamming back into place, but this time it was different. A slow, wicked smirk spread across his muddy face. "My bad, Captain," Jackson whispered, his voice dark and dripping with a sudden, heavy amusement. He pushed himself up slowly, deliberately letting his hands drag along Kale's chest as he stood. "Didn't mean to keep you down so long." Kale lay in the mud for a second, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He was straight. He was the captain. He hated Jackson. So why was his skin burning where Jackson had touched him? The next day, the war changed. Jackson completely abandoned his strategy of open rebellion. He stopped ignoring plays. He stopped the illegal hits during practice. Instead, he initiated a psychological campaign that left Kale completely unmoored. Jackson started teasing him. It began in the locker room. The space was always filled with the smell of deep heat, damp towels, and the heavy humidity of the communal showers. Kale, as captain, usually took the corner bench, organizing his gear and mentally preparing for practice. Jackson walked in, a towel slung low over his hips, his skin still damp and glowing from the shower. Instead of going to his own locker, he walked directly into Kale's personal space. "Nice play calls today, Cap," Jackson said, leaning against the locker right next to Kale's head. He was close enough that Kale could smell his body wash, something sharp, like cedar and mint. Kale tensed, refusing to look up from his cleats. "You actually followed them for once. Congratulations." "Oh, I can follow orders," Jackson murmured, his voice dropping an octave, meant only for Kale's ears over the din of the other boys shouting. "If the person giving them knows what they're doing." Kale's head snapped up. Jackson was staring down at him, that same wicked smirk playing on his lips. There was a challenge in his eyes, but it wasn't the hostile challenge from a week ago. It was an invitation. "What is your problem, Jackson?" Kale demanded, standing up. He was an inch taller than Jackson, and significantly broader, but Jackson didn't back down. In fact, he leaned in a fraction closer. "No problem here," Jackson said, reaching out. Kale flinched, expecting a shove. Instead, Jackson's fingers lightly flicked a piece of stray lint off the collar of Kale's polo shirt. The brush of Jackson's knuckles against Kale's collarbone sent a jolt of electricity straight down Kale's spine. "See you on the pitch?" Jackson whispered, turning and walking away, leaving Kale staring after him. His breath caught in his throat and his hands balled into tight fists. Kale was losing his mind. He didn't understand the game Jackson was playing. He convinced himself it was a psychological tactic to break his focus. Jackson wanted the captaincy, and he was trying to unnerve Kale to prove he was mentally weak. But the teasing didn't stop in the locker room. It leaked onto the pitch. In the scrum, tightly packed together, shoulders grinding against shoulders, Jackson would purposefully press himself flush against Kale's side. "Push harder, Kale," Jackson would pant in his ear over the grunts of the opposing pack. "You're holding back." When Kale would successfully complete a tackle, Jackson would be the first one there to pull him up, his grip on Kale's hand lingering just a second too long, his thumb pressing into Kale's palm. Kale found himself snapping at his teammates, unable to sleep, and entirely unable to focus on his classes. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Jackson's dark eyes looking down at him in the mud. He felt the phantom heat of Jackson's chest against his back. It was infuriating. It was terrifying. And, God help him, it was intoxicating. Friday night under the floodlights, they played their bitter crosstown rivals. And for the first time all season, Kale and Jackson clicked. It was as if the intense, confusing tension between them had finally found an outlet in the violent poetry of the game. Kale would clear a path and Jackson was instantly there, taking the offload and sprinting for a try. They didn't even need to speak. They moved around each other like binary stars, bound by a gravitational pull they couldn't control. They won the match by 20 points. The team was ecstatic. After the final whistle, the pitch was flooded with students, parents, and friends. Kale was exhausted, covered in grass stains and sweat, his muscles screaming. He was looking for a water bottle when he felt a small hand tug on his sleeve. It was Sarah. She looked flushed, wearing a St. Jude's beanie, her eyes wide with excitement. "Kale, you were incredible," she beamed. "Thanks, Sarah," Kale panted, wiping his forehead with the back of his hand. Can I talk to you for a second?" she asked, glancing around at the chaotic crowd. "Just over here?" She pointed toward the shadowy area underneath the home bleachers. Kale frowned, his instincts telling him this was a bad idea, but his innate politeness forced him to nod. "Yeah, sure. Just for a minute. I need to get to the locker room." They walked under the metal scaffolding. The noise of the crowd was muffled here. Sarah turned to him, her cheeks burning bright red in the dim light. "I just wanted to say, I really like watching you play," Sarah started, nervously twisting the straps of her bag. "And I know you're super busy with being captain and everything, but I was wondering if maybe you'd want to get coffee this weekend? Like a date." Kale froze. This was it. This was the normal, straight, high school experience he was supposed to want. Pretty sweet girl was asking him out. He should say yes. He opened his mouth to reply, but before a single syllable could escape, a heavy, muscular arm wrapped tightly around his neck from behind. "There you are, Cap." A voice purred directly into Kale's ear. Kale jumped, the heat of Jackson's sweaty, exhausted body pressing flush against his back. Jackson had his arms slung over Kale's shoulders in a mockery of teammate camaraderie, his hand gripping Kale's bicep tight enough to bruise. "Jackson, what the hell?" Kale started to pull away, but Jackson tightened his grip, stepping around to Kale's side but keeping them plastered together. Jackson looked at Sarah. His eyes were cold, dark, and utterly territorial. He looked like a predator that had just found someone sniffing around his kill. "Sorry to interrupt," Jackson said, his voice dripping with faux politeness, "but the coach needs his captain in the locker room. Team strategy stuff. You know how it is. It's a closed-door thing." Sarah looked completely bewildered. "Oh, I didn't mean to." "It's fine," Jackson said smoothly. He squeezed Kale's bicep again, his thumb dragging across the skin. "He's just really busy right now. Come on, Kale. Boys are waiting." Without waiting for Sarah to finish her thought, Jackson physically turned Kale around and began marching him toward the fieldhouse. Kale was too stunned to fight back for the first 10 yards. The sheer audacity of Jackson's interference, combined with the electric heat radiating from the arm still firmly draped around his shoulders, short-circuited his brain. As they approached the heavy metal doors of the fieldhouse, Kale finally snapped out of it. He violently shoved Jackson's arm off him. "What the fuck is wrong with you?" Kale roared, the exhaustion of the game boiling over into pure rage. "You can't just drag me away like that." Jackson didn't look remorseful. He looked wired. "I was saving you." "Saving me from what?" "She was asking me out. And you were going to say no." Jackson shot back, his chest heaving. "You don't know that." "Yes, I do," Jackson snarled, stepping into Kale's space. The locker room hallway was completely empty, the rest of the team still celebrating on the pitch. It was just the two of them, the heavy thrum of adrenaline, and the hum of the fluorescent lights. "You are out of your mind," Kale breathed, his chest rising and falling heavily. "You've been playing these sick mind games for weeks, Jackson. What do you want from me? You want the captaincy? Take it. Tell coach you want it. Just stop messing with my head." Kale turned and shoved his way through the double doors into the dark, empty locker room, aiming for his bag. He didn't hear Jackson follow him, but suddenly, a hand grabbed his shoulder and shoved him hard. Kale stumbled backward, his spine slamming into the cold metal of the lockers. The impact rattled the steel. Before Kale could raise his hands to defend himself, Jackson was there. Jackson pressed him flush against the lockers, his forearms bracketing Kale's head, pinning him exactly like he had in the mud 3 weeks ago. Only this time there was no rain. There was no audience. "You think this is about a piece of fabric on my arm?" Jackson demanded, his voice low, shaking with an intensity that made Kale's breath hitch. "You think I give a shit about being captain? Then what is it?" Kale yelled back, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He couldn't look away from Jackson's mouth. "Why are you doing this?" Jackson leaned in. He was so close that Kale could feel the heat of his breath, could see the slight tremble in Jackson's jaw. The arrogance was gone. There was only raw, unfiltered hunger. "I'm doing this," Jackson whispered, his eyes dropping to Kale's lips, "because you're looking at me right now exactly the way you've wanted to look at me since the day you became captain." Kale swallowed hard, his throat dry. I don't like guys, Jackson. I hate you." "Liar," Jackson breathed. He closed his eyes for a second, leaning his forehead against Kale's. "Tell me to stop. Tell me to back off right now. And I swear to God, Kale, I will walk out that door and I will never touch you again. Tell me you want that girl. Tell me to stop." The locker room was dead silent, save for the ragged sound of their breathing. Kale's mind was screaming at him to push Jackson away, to yell, to assert his straightness, his authority, his control. But his body wasn't listening. His body felt like it was on fire. He looked at Jackson, at the sweat on his brow, the bruise forming on his cheekbone from the game, the desperate, beautiful vulnerability in his usually arrogant eyes. Kale realized, with a terrifying, earth-shattering clarity, that if Jackson walked away right now, it would destroy him. Kale brought his hands up, but he didn't push. He grabbed the front of Jackson's sweat-soaked jersey, curling his fists into the fabric. "Don't," Kale whispered, his voice cracking. "Don't stop." The fraction of a second between Kale's whispered surrender and Jackson's movement felt like an eternity suspended in amber. Then the amber shattered. Jackson didn't just kiss him, he collided with him. The impact drove Kale's shoulders back against the cold steel of the lockers with a heavy, resonating thud. There was nothing gentle or practiced about it. It was a chaotic, desperate clash of teeth, bruised lips, and hot, ragged breaths. For months, their interactions had been defined by a psychological defense mechanism so thick neither of them had fully recognized it. The shoving matches, the biting insults, the deliberate sabotage on the pitch, it had all been a localized reaction formation, a way to transmute an attraction that terrified them both into a hostility they could easily understand and control. Now, that defense was completely stripped away, leaving only the raw, volatile energy beneath. Kale's hands, still fisted in the fabric of Jackson's jersey, pulled the winger closer until there wasn't a millimeter of space between their chests. The adrenaline from 80 minutes of brutal rugby bled seamlessly into this new, entirely different kind of physical exertion. Jackson's hands moved frantically, one gripping the nape of Kale's neck, his fingers tangling in the short, sweat-dampened hair, while the other slid down to grip Kale's waist, anchoring him. Kale opened his mouth beneath the pressure of Jackson's, a soft, involuntary groan escaping the back of his throat. The sound seemed to electrocute Jackson. He pressed into Kale harder, his tongue sweeping past Kale's lips, tasting like salt, rain, and the metallic tang of blood from a busted lip he'd taken in the second half. It was overwhelming. Kale's entire worldview, his rigid structure, his carefully mapped-out identity, was rapidly rewriting itself under the bruising pressure of Jackson's mouth. He had spent 18 years believing he knew exactly who he was and what he wanted. But the way Jackson's thumb stroked the sensitive skin just beneath his ear sent a cascade of heat straight to his core, rendering his past certainties completely irrelevant. "Jackson," Kale breathed against his mouth, a desperate, breathless sound. "I've got you," Jackson mumbled back, kissing the corner of his mouth, his jaw, the erratic pulse point at his throat. The sheer vulnerability in Jackson's voice, the total absence of his usual arrogant armor, shook Kale to his bones. They were so consumed by the sensory overload of each other that they almost didn't hear it. The heavy, metallic clank of the fieldhouse's outer doors swinging open echoed down the concrete hallway, followed by the raucous, booming laughter of the tight head prop and the screeching voices of the rest of the team finally making their way back from the pitch. The sound sliced through the heavy atmosphere like a knife. Kale violently shoved at Jackson's chest, the instinct for self-preservation instantly overriding his desire. Jackson stumbled back a few steps, his chest heaving, his lips swollen, a dazed, euphoric look in his dark eyes. Kale was panicked. He spun around, slamming his locker open with unnecessary force just as the double doors to the main room swung wide, letting in a flood of sweaty, victorious teenage boys. "Hell of a match, Cap!" someone shouted, snapping a wet towel against the benches. Kale stared unblinkingly at the playbook taped to the inside of his locker door, his heart hammering against his ribs like a jackhammer. "Yeah," he managed to choke out, his voice thick and unsteady. "Good job, guys." He didn't dare look to his left. He didn't dare look at Jackson. If he did, he knew every single person in that room would be able to read the truth written all over his flushed face. He grabbed his duffel bag, threw his street clothes inside without showering, and practically sprinted for the exit, leaving Jackson standing in the middle of the locker room, watching him flee. The weekend was agonizing. Kale was a master of compartmentalization. It was how he managed to maintain straight A's, lead a varsity sports team, and keep his family happy. When something was stressful or didn't fit into his neat, orderly life, he mentally placed it in a box, locked it, and shoved it onto a high shelf in his brain. He tried to do this with Jackson. He spent Saturday and Sunday aggressively avoiding his phone, refusing to look at the 3 text messages from an unsaved number that he knew, deep down, were from his winger. He threw himself into his calculus homework and ran endless, punishing miles around his neighborhood until his lungs burned, trying to exhaust the phantom sensation of Jackson's hands on his skin. He convinced himself it was a mistake, a momentary lapse in judgment fueled by post-game adrenaline and Jackson's manipulative mind games. He just needed to re-establish the boundary. When Monday afternoon practice rolled around, Kale arrived early, his face set in a stony mask of pure business. When Jackson finally sauntered onto the pitch, the air between them instantly thickened. Jackson's eyes locked onto Kale immediately. There was no smirk today. There was a quiet, intense expectation. Jackson walked toward him, the distance closing rapidly. "Kale," Jackson said, his voice dropping low as he stepped into Kale's orbit. "We're running defensive line drills today," Kale interrupted sharply, his voice carrying just enough volume for the nearby forwards to hear. He kept his eyes fixed firmly on the clipboard in his hand, refusing to meet Jackson's gaze. "I want you on the far wing. Don't crowd the center." Jackson stopped dead in his tracks. The vulnerability that had cracked his armor on Friday night vanished in an instant, replaced by a cold, hardened shell. Kale's blatant dismissal, his retreat back behind the walls of his straight, rigid captain persona, hit Jackson like a physical blow. Jackson's jaw locked. His defense mechanisms flared up to protect a sudden, sharp ache in his chest. "Right? Whatever you say, Captain." The word was spat out like a curse. The practice was a disaster. The fragile synchronization they had discovered on Friday night was completely shattered. Jackson reverted to his old ways, but worse. It wasn't teasing anymore. It was punishing. He purposefully ignored Kale's calls, took the ball into contact when he should have passed, and tackled with a reckless, bitter aggression that earned him a screaming reprimand from Coach Miller. Kale felt sick to his stomach. Every time Jackson glared at him with that cold, wounded fury, Kale felt a fracture in his carefully constructed compartments. He was hurting Jackson, and worse, he was hurting the team. On Wednesday, Coach Miller had had enough. "The two of you in the A/V room. Now," Miller barked at the end of practice, pointing a thick finger at Kale and Jackson. "You played like a well-oiled machine on Friday, and this week you look like you've never seen a rugby ball in your lives. You are going to sit in that room, watch the tape of Friday's match, and figure out how to communicate. And don't come out until you do." The A/V room was essentially a converted storage closet. It smelled faintly of floor wax and ozone, containing nothing but a small desk, a television monitor, and 2 folding chairs pushed uncomfortably close together. Kale walked in first, feeling like he was walking to his execution. He sat in the chair on the right, keeping his posture painfully rigid. Jackson followed, kicking the heavy wooden door shut with his heel. The click of the latch sounded deafeningly loud in the tiny, quiet space. Jackson didn't sit. He crossed his arms over his chest and leaned against the door, staring down at Kale. The television monitor illuminated the small room with a pale, flickering blue light, casting long shadows across the sharp angles of Jackson's face. "Put the tape on," Jackson said, his voice completely devoid of emotion. Kale fumbled with the remote, hitting play. The screen showed the wide, static angle of the pitch from Friday night. Silent figures moved across the green grass. They sat in suffocating silence for 10 minutes, watching themselves on the screen. The footage was undeniable. Every time Kale looked for an outlet, Jackson was already moving into the perfect position. Every time Jackson made a break, Kale was trailing just behind him in support. It was a physical dialogue, a deep, instinctual understanding of each other's movements and intentions. "Look at that," Jackson suddenly said, his voice breaking the silence. He pointed at the screen. Kale flinched slightly but looked. On the screen, Kale was setting up for a pass. Before he even turned his head, Jackson had already accelerated into the gap. You shift your weight to your left heel a half-second before you pivot, Jackson murmured, stepping away from the door and moving closer to the desk. You don't even know you're doing it. But I do. I can read your physical tells before you even make a conscious decision. Kale swallowed hard, his throat dry. I don't. Shut up, Kale, Jackson said softly. He pulled the second chair out and sat down. He didn't sit facing the screen. He turned the chair so he was facing Kale directly, their knees mere inches apart. Kale stared stubbornly at the television, his hands gripping his kneecaps so hard his knuckles were white. You can't box this up, Jackson said, his voice dropping the bitter edge, replacing it with a quiet, pleading sincerity. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. I know how your brain works. You like control. You like rules. I break your rules, and it scares the shit out of you. Kale squeezed his eyes shut. Jackson, please. You don't understand. My family, the team, everything I've planned. I'm not asking you to stand on a float in a parade tomorrow, Kale, Jackson interrupted gently. Slowly, deliberately, Jackson reached out. He didn't grab Kale's shirt or shove him against a locker. He simply rested his hand over Kale's white-knuckled grip on his own knee. The touch was warm, grounding, and incredibly careful. It was an act of profound restraint from a boy who usually took whatever he wanted by force. I'm just asking you to stop lying to yourself when we're alone, Jackson whispered. You're exhausting yourself trying to hate me when you don't. Kale slowly opened his eyes and turned his head. Jackson was looking at him with an expression of such open, raw affection that it completely dismantled the last remaining walls of Kale's defenses. This wasn't a game. This wasn't a power struggle for the captaincy. Jackson saw him, the real him, beneath the discipline and the expectations and wanted him anyway. The cognitive dissonance broke. Kale flipped his hand over, intertwining his fingers with Jackson's. The simple, quiet intimacy of the gesture in the dim blue light of the A/V room felt heavier than the kiss in the locker room. I don't hate you, Kale confessed, his voice barely a breath. I'm just terrified. A soft, genuine smile finally broke across Jackson's face, illuminating the dark room. He squeezed Kale's hand. I know, Cap, but you don't have to be. Not with me. Jackson leaned in slowly, giving Kale every opportunity to pull away. When Kale didn't move, Jackson closed the final distance, pressing his lips to Kale's in a soft, exploratory kiss. There was no bruising urgency this time. It was slow, deliberate, and deeply communicative. It was a promise. Kale let out a long, shuddering breath, his shoulders finally dropping away from his ears as he kissed Jackson back, letting the reality of it finally sink into his bones. The shift in their dynamic was invisible to the outside world, but on the pitch it was electric. They didn't announce anything. They didn't hold hands in the hallways. To the rest of the school, they were still the stern captain and the arrogant winger. But the hostility had evaporated, replaced by a secret, buzzing undercurrent of shared intimacy. During practice, when the team huddled up, Jackson would stand casually behind Kale. To anyone else, it just looked like they were crowded together. But Kale could feel the distinct, deliberate press of Jackson's chest against his back, a silent, heavy reassurance that grounded him. The teasing returned, but the malice was gone. You're overthinking the line-out, Kale, Jackson whispered to him one afternoon as they jogged back to their starting positions. I'm assessing the wind, Jackson. Something you'd know about if you ever paid attention. Kale shot back, but he couldn't hide the small, private smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. I pay attention to plenty of things, Jackson smirked, his eyes dropping briefly, suggestively, down Kale's body before snapping back up to his eyes. Especially your form. Kale felt a flush of heat rise up his neck, shaking his head as he jogged away to hide his smile. The true test of their new dynamic came during the final match of the regular season. They were down by 5 points, with only 2 minutes left on the clock. The opposing team was massive, playing a brutal, grinding defensive game. They were locked in a desperate, muddy scrum near the try line. The pressure was immense. Kale was straining, his legs burning, the air punched from his lungs by the sheer weight of the opposing pack. Suddenly, through the chaos and the grunting, Kale felt a hand grip his hip binding. It wasn't the frantic, grasping hold of a tired teammate. It was firm, deliberate, and undeniably Jackson. The winger had stepped into the scrum half position, waiting for the ball to emerge. Jackson's thumb pressed hard into the muscle just above Kale's hip bone. It was a physical cue, a silent message transmitted directly through the chaos. "I'm right here. I'm ready. Trust me." Kale felt a surge of adrenaline that had nothing to do with the sport and everything to do with the boy behind him. He gritted his teeth, digging his cleats deep into the turf. "Push!" Kale roared, channeling every ounce of his strength into the drive. The pack surged forward. The ball popped loose. In a blur of motion, Jackson scooped it up, completely bypassing the standard pass, and dove straight over the chaotic pile of bodies, slamming the ball down over the white line just as the final whistle blew. The pitch erupted. St. Jude's had won. The team swarmed Jackson, burying him under a pile of muddy, screaming bodies. Kale stood back for a moment, his chest heaving, wiping the mud from his eyes. When the pile finally untangled and the boys started pulling each other to their feet, Jackson broke through the crowd. He was covered in mud, bleeding from a small cut above his eyebrow, and grinning like a madman. He locked eyes with Kale. Surrounded by roaring crowds, cheering teammates, and the deafening noise of victory, they shared a single, private look. It was a look that spoke of stolen moments in the A/V room, hushed whispers in the locker room, and a profound, terrifying vulnerability that they had both finally embraced. Jackson didn't hug him. He didn't kiss him. He simply walked up, bumped his shoulder heavily against Kale's, and leaned in close enough for only Kale to hear. "Good call, Captain," Jackson murmured, his dark eyes shining. Kale looked at the boy he was supposed to hate, the boy who had completely dismantled his perfectly ordered world and rebuilt it into something entirely new, and smiled. "I couldn't have done it without you, Jackson."